On June 7, 1942, the USS Yorktown slipped beneath the Pacific Ocean in silence. She was the largest American aircraft carrier in the fleet, a ship that had already proven herself in battle, a vessel that had sent enemy aircraft to the bottom with her own warplanes. But that morning, as her hull broke the surface tension one last time, the men watching from rescue vessels knew they were witnessing the death of something irreplaceable. The Yorktown was supposed to be unsinkable, and yet there she was, surrendering to the deep. For over 80 years, military historians accepted the official story without question. Bombs and torpedoes had crippled her. Japanese attacks had done fatal damage. Her loss was inevitable. Case closed. But when advanced underwater drones descended nearly 3 miles beneath the surface in 2023 and again in 2025, they discovered something that forced historians to ask a question the official record had never addressed. Was the USS Yorktown truly beyond saving, or did critical failures made under impossible pressure doom her long before the Japanese even found her? The answers waiting in the darkness would change everything we thought we knew about the Battle of Midway and the men who fought it. The story begins before the sinking, before the torpedoes, before the battle that would decide the war in the Pacific. It begins in 1936, when the Yorktown was christened at a shipyard in Newport News, Virginia. Eleanor Roosevelt herself served as sponsor, breaking the ceremonial bottle across the bow as thousands of workers and Navy officials watched. The Yorktown represented the cutting edge of American naval engineering. She measured 8-9 feet from bow to stern. Her flight deck could launch and recover 90 aircraft. Her wartime crew would number nearly 3,000 men. She was the lead ship of her class, and her sister carriers, the Enterprise and the Hornet, would follow in her wake. Together, they would form the spine of American naval power in the Pacific. By the start of 1942, the Yorktown had already tasted combat. She participated in raids on the Marshall Islands and the Gilbert Islands. She struck at Salamaua. She operated off the coast of Australia, standing between the advancing Japanese fleet and Port Moresby, a vital stronghold the enemy desperately wanted to capture. At the Battle of the Coral Sea in May of 1942, the Yorktown's aircraft helped deliver a crushing blow to the Japanese advance. They sank the light carrier Shoho. For the first time, the Japanese understood that America had carriers that could fight back. But victory came with a terrible price. Japanese dive bombers descended through anti-aircraft fire. One 551-pound bomb punched through the Yorktown's flight deck and detonated 6 levels below. The explosion sent shockwaves through her hull. Near misses opened seams in her outer plating. Fuel oil poured into the water, creating a slick 10 miles long. The Yorktown limped toward Pearl Harbor, trailing that black wake like a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. Naval engineers examined the damage and delivered their assessment. This ship needed 90 days of repairs. Minimum. But Admiral Chester Nimitz had received information that changed everything. American code breakers had cracked the Japanese naval communications. The enemy was coming. A massive Japanese fleet was heading for a tiny atoll called Midway, a remote dot of sand in the middle of the Pacific that controlled the approaches to Hawaii itself. The attack would come on June 4th. Nimitz had exactly 1 week to prepare. He had 2 undamaged carriers, the Enterprise and the Hornet. Against 4 Japanese fleet carriers, that was nowhere near enough. He needed the Yorktown, and he needed her in 3 days. On May 27th, the wounded carrier eased into dry dock number 1 at Pearl Harbor. Inspection teams swarmed across her hull. Water still pooled in the basin as they examined the burst seams, the buckled plates, the damage that should have kept her in the yard for months. Admiral Nimitz stood among them, staring at the devastation. Then he turned to his officers and said words that would become legend. "We must have this ship back in 3 days." Silence. The officers exchanged glances. 3 days was impossible. One of them, a hull repair expert named Lieutenant Commander H.J. Finstag, swallowed hard and spoke. "Yes, sir." What followed was an extraordinary feat of industrial will that bordered on the miraculous. Over 1,400 workers descended on the Yorktown. They worked around the clock, under floodlights. Rolling blackouts swept across the island of Oahu to provide enough electricity for the welding torches. Men ate sandwiches while their cutting torches hissed and sparked. They fell asleep on the deck where they dropped, then woke to keep working. In 72 hours, they had patched the flight deck so cleanly that it appeared to have never been damaged at all. They sealed breaches in the hull. They made her seaworthy. But there was a problem. A fundamental problem that no one wanted to address. The superheater boilers that had been damaged at Coral Sea were never touched. There simply wasn't time. The repairs they made were welded rather than riveted. Welding was faster, but welds are rigid. Riveted joints flex. Under stress, they absorb shock. Welds transmit it. The Yorktown's top speed would be limited to 20 knots instead of her designed 32. 12 knots might not sound like much, but in combat against determined enemy pilots, those 12 missing notes could be the difference between life and death. And the electrical system had been hastily restored after taking damage at Coral Sea. It had never been fully tested. On May 30th, the Yorktown steamed out of Pearl Harbor to join the Enterprise and the Hornet. Thousands of shipyard workers lined the docks cheering. The Japanese believed she was already sunk. They had no idea she was coming. The ship carried vulnerabilities that no one discussed. Shortcuts had been made under impossible pressure. Systems had never been fully tested. These weaknesses would not matter unless everything went wrong at once. At Midway, everything would go wrong at once. The morning of June 4th, 1942 would decide the war in the Pacific. 4 Japanese carriers steamed toward Midway, the same striking force that had devastated Pearl Harbor 7 months earlier. Against them stood 3 American carriers, the Enterprise, the Hornet, and the ship the Japanese believed was already on the bottom of the Coral Sea, the Yorktown. Shortly after 10 in the morning, Yorktown launched 17 dauntless dive bombers. They screamed down through the clouds and found their target. The Japanese carrier Soyu had her deck packed with aircraft being refueled and rearmed. 3 bombs struck home. Within 20 minutes, the Soyu was burning, engulfed in flames, lost. The Enterprise's bombers found the Akagi and the Kaga, 3 Japanese fleet carriers destroyed in 5 minutes. But one remained. The Hiru launched everything she had, and all of it was aimed at the Yorktown. At around noon, 18 Japanese dive bombers appeared above the American task force. They descended through a wall of anti-aircraft fire. The Yorktown's gunners blazed away, but 3 bombs still found their mark. One struck the flight deck. Another plunged down the smokestack and disabled 5 boilers. The third started fires below decks. The explosions tore through compartments. Smoke billowed upward. The ship shuddered with the impact. Japanese pilots flew home and reported the Yorktown destroyed. They were wrong. Damage control parties moved with practiced efficiency. They extinguished the fires within an hour. Engineers worked frantically to restore electrical power. 4 of the 5 disabled boilers came back online. Flight deck crews patched the bomb holes so quickly and so carefully that returning American pilots could not tell where the bombs had hit. By 2 in the afternoon, the Yorktown was making 20 knots and preparing to launch aircraft again. But the Japanese were not finished. They had failed to kill her the first time. They would have to try again. At 2:30 in the afternoon, 10 Japanese K torpedo bombers pressed through the anti-aircraft fire. The Yorktown was limited to 20 knots. The Enterprise and the Hornet could make 32. Against determined attackers flying torpedo bombers, those missing knots meant everything. Two torpedoes slammed into the starboard side within 30 seconds of each other. The explosions were catastrophic. Fuel tanks ruptured, compartments flooded across 50 feet of the hull, the rudder jammed, then the lights went out. All steam pressure dropped to zero. The main electrical power failed completely for a moment. And after emergency diesel generator started, hope, then the circuit breakers failed to hold, short circuits rippled through the hastily repaired wiring, the backup power became useless. Without electricity, the pumps couldn't run. Without pumps, the flooding couldn't be controlled. The Yorktown was paralyzed. She began to list. The angle grew steeper, 23 degrees, 26 degrees. The deck became a slope, equipment slid, the crew struggled to maintain footing. Captain Buckmaster conferred with his damage control officer. Both men reached the same conclusion. The ship would capsize within minutes. They had maybe 2,000 men on deck, and below, if the Yorktown rolled, hundreds would be trapped in spaces that would become sealed chambers. Hundreds more would slide into the water with no chance of rescue. At 5:02 in the afternoon, Captain Buckmaster gave the order that no captain wants to give. Abandon ship. The crew went over the side in good order. Men climbed down nets, jumped into the water, swam toward rescue ships. Buckmaster himself was the last to leave, touring the ship one final time before lowering himself into the Pacific. Behind him, the Yorktown floated alone in the darkness. And then something unexpected happened. She did not capsize. She did not sink. Against all odds, against the verdict of her captain and damage control officers, the Yorktown refused to die. Through the night of June 6th, she drifted. Two men were discovered still alive aboard the next morning, one of them signaling with machine gun fire to rescue vessels. They were picked up and told an incredible story. The ship was still floating. Captain Buckmaster organized a salvage party. 170 volunteers reboarded the wounded carrier on June 6th. The tug Vireo took her under tow. The destroyer Hammond came alongside to provide emergency power. The crew jettisoned equipment to reduce weight. They counter-flooded compartments on the opposite side to correct the list. Slowly, the angle began to decrease. 2 degrees of list were recovered. Then 4. The ship was responding to treatment. She was coming back to life. They were actually saving her. The salvage operation was working. But at dawn on June 7th, something appeared on the radar. A contact. A Japanese submarine. The I-168 had slipped through the American screen undetected. The submarine rose to periscope depth and fired 4 torpedoes. The first one struck the destroyer Hammond. The explosion ripped the ship in half. More than 80 sailors died in the blast and the flames that followed. 2 more torpedoes found the Yorktown. The salvage party heard the explosions and knew it was over. They evacuated. The Yorktown, floating and recovering, began to sink. At dawn on June 7th, she rolled onto her beam ends and slipped beneath the surface. Down and down into the darkness. 3 miles down, her hull settling onto the sea floor, coming to rest in a place where the sun's light had never reached. The official history was written quickly. The conclusion seemed obvious. The Yorktown had been damaged repeatedly. Bombs at Midway, torpedoes at Midway, another submarine attack on June 7th. The weight of accumulated damage was simply too much. She had to go down. The ship was lost. End of story. Except there was a problem with that story. She had floated for 3 days after abandonment. The salvage crew was actually making progress. The circuit breakers that killed her power had failed under circumstances no one fully understood. Why had they failed? The diesel generator had started. Power was available. Short circuits in hastily repaired wiring had made the backup system useless. Was this connected to the 72-hour repair miracle at Pearl Harbor? Had the rushed work left vulnerabilities in the electrical systems? Had the welded patches weakened the hull's structural integrity, making it more vulnerable to the torpedo damage? Why did the blast damage from the Japanese torpedoes extend 52 feet when Pearl Harbor ships had shown damage extending only 36 feet? What had the crew been doing on the hangar deck when the torpedoes hit? Were there still aircraft aboard when she sank? The questions accumulated, but the answers had vanished beneath the Pacific. For 56 years, the Yorktown lay untouched. 3 miles down, beyond the reach of divers, beyond the reach of light. In 1998, a legendary oceanographer named Robert Ballard, the same man who had discovered the Titanic, turned his attention to the Pacific. A joint expedition with the United States Navy and National Geographic descended into the darkness northwest of Hawaii. What they found was remarkable. The Yorktown sat upright on the seafloor. Her hull was largely intact. Her island superstructure was recognizable. After more than half a century on the bottom, she looked like a ship that had simply settled into place and gone to sleep. But the 1998 expedition faced severe limitations. The depth pushed every piece of equipment to its absolute limits. Remotely operated vehicles failed. Dive time was cut short. The cameras could circle the wreck and document her exterior, but they could not penetrate her interior. The hangar deck remained sealed in darkness. Whatever lay inside, whatever artifacts might explain her final hours, stayed hidden. The 1998 expedition confirmed where the Yorktown rested and captured her final resting pose, but the internal details remained inaccessible. The technology simply didn't exist yet to go inside. For 25 more years, those questions remained unanswered. And then in September of 2023, technology had finally caught up with ambition. The Ocean Exploration Trust deployed an advanced ROV called the Atlantis from the research vessel Nautilus. The mission was part of a larger expedition to document the entire Midway battlefield. For the first time, researchers conducted a comprehensive archaeological survey of the Yorktown. They recorded over 14 hours of dive footage. They performed methodical documentation of the hull at every elevation. They assessed battle damage visible from the outside. And then, as they passed by an open hangar door, something caught their attention. A shadowy shape that looked like an aircraft wing appeared in the lights. Equipment limitations prevented a closer investigation. The question lingered. Was there really an aircraft inside? What else might be preserved in that sealed space? In April of 2025, NOAA returned with the research vessel Okeanos Explorer. This time, the mission had a specific goal: penetration. They sent the remotely operated vehicle Deep Discoverer into spaces no camera had ever entered, through the elevator shafts, into the hangar deck, into the spaces where the Yorktown's crew had fought and worked and prepared for battle only 83 years earlier. The remotely operated vehicle descended into the number 2 elevator shaft. Light swept across the corroded walls, and then the operators saw it, and they fell silent. A massive mural, 42 feet wide, 12 feet tall, a hand-painted world map tracking every voyage the USS Yorktown had made since her commissioning in 1937, a chart of the cruises of the USS Yorktown. The colors were still vivid after 83 years in total darkness. Blues marking the oceans she had crossed, greens showing the lands she had visited. Lines traced her path from Norfolk, Virginia, all the way across the country, through the Panama Canal, and into the vast expanse of the Pacific. The routes of her combat missions showed beneath streaks of rust and sediment. One researcher watching the live feed spoke first. "This is the first time we are seeing this whole image. This is history in the making. I am absolutely flabbergasted by the state of preservation." The mural had been known to exist from old photographs taken aboard ship decades earlier, but no one had ever documented the complete work. No one knew if it had survived the sinking. It had. For 83 years, in total darkness, 3 miles beneath the Pacific, the crew's pride remained painted on the walls, a testament to who they were and where they had been, a time capsule no one expected to find intact, a direct message from men who had been dead for more than 8 decades, saying, "We were here, we mattered, this ship mattered." The remotely operated vehicle drifted deeper into the interior toward the portside hangar deck. The roller doors were either missing or frozen in the open position. For the first time in history, cameras entered the Yorktown's interior. What they found changed everything known about the Midway battlefield. Aircraft, at least 3 Douglas dive bombers, the same type that had sunk the Japanese carrier Soryu on the morning of June 4th. One lay inverted on the deck, its landing gear visible, its wings still recognizable despite 83 years on the ocean floor. Beneath another fuselage, secured in its release cradle, hung a bomb, still armed. Researchers identified one aircraft as likely Bureau number 4581, a plane from the Enterprise's bombing squadron. Enterprise aircraft, landing on the Yorktown when their own carrier was under attack or too far away to recover them safely. The implication struck immediately. The carriers had operated as a team, they had shared resources, they had absorbed each other's aircraft. The Navy had not simply been fighting separate battles. The 3 American carriers at Midway had fought as a single organism, with the Yorktown serving as both a platform for her own aircraft and a refuge for aircraft from her sister ships. Deeper in the hangar deck, something appeared in the lights that made absolutely no sense. A vehicle. 4 wheels, a rectangular body, a canvas top in tatters, a chrome bumper still gleaming faintly under the powerful lights, a civilian automobile on an aircraft carrier. Operators stared at the screens. One spoke what everyone was thinking. That is a car. Closer inspection revealed distinctive details. A spare tire mounted on the rear, a split windshield, parking lights positioned above the headlights, chrome fender trim, the distinctive boxy shape of a late 1930s or early 1940s American automobile. Researchers identified it as a 1940 or 1941 Ford Super Deluxe, the woody model with wood-painted sides, a completely civilian vehicle sitting in the hangar of an aircraft carrier during the most important naval battle of the Pacific War. No records explain its presence. No official documentation mention it. No historian had any idea it was there. Leading theories emerged quickly. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher had commanded Task Force 17 from the Yorktown's flag bridge. Senior officers sometimes brought personal vehicles aboard for use in port cities. Perhaps the car belonged to Fletcher himself, but no records confirmed this. No official manifests listed an automobile among the Yorktown's cargo and equipment. The Navy issued an open request to automobile experts and the public, asking for any information that might solve the mystery. The origin of the car remained and remains unsolved. Why was a Ford station wagon sitting in the hangar of an aircraft carrier in June of 1942? The answer lies somewhere in time, lost to the men who might have explained it. The cameras documented what history books had only described: bomb damage on the main deck near the midship elevator, craters where explosions had torn through steel, structural deformation radiating outward from the points of impact, extensive damage along the port side hull, torpedo strikes that had killed her power, plates buckled inward by the force of the blast, seams ruptured across dozens of feet, and the anti-aircraft guns still mounted, still trained upward, frozen in the positions they had held when the crew was fighting for the ship's life. The physical evidence told its own story. Men had fought here. They had fired until there was nothing left to fire at. They had worked to save their ship until the power failed and the list grew too steep to climb. The damage patterns revealed the sequence of destruction, but they also raised critical questions that the official history had never addressed. How much of the hull's vulnerability came from the damage at Coral Sea? How much came from the repairs that were never completed? How much came from the decision to weld instead of rivet, to prioritize speed over permanence? The wreck could not answer directly, but for the first time, researchers had the physical evidence to ask the questions, to demand answers, to challenge the comfortable narrative. The 72-hour repair at Pearl Harbor had become legend. 1,400 workers, rolling blackouts across an island at war. A ship patched together through sheer industrial will and determination. The story is told as triumph, and it was triumph, but triumph casts a shadow. The superheated boilers were never repaired. The Yorktown went to Midway limited to 20 knots. When the torpedo bombers attacked, she could not outmaneuver them the way the Enterprise or the Hornet could have. Those 12 missing knots were not incidental. They were the difference between escape and paralysis. The hull patches were welded instead of riveted. Faster to install, faster to complete. But when the Japanese torpedoes exploded against the Yorktown's hull, damage extended 52 feet from the point of impact. Ships torpedoed at Pearl Harbor showed damage extending no more than 36 feet. The welded patches may have transmitted shock through the hull rather than absorbing it. The emergency diesel generator had worked. Power was available, but the electrical system, damaged at Coral Sea and repaired under impossible time pressure, had never been fully tested. When the circuit breakers failed, no one could explain why. Short circuits occurred in wiring that had been hastily restored. The miracle that got the Yorktown to Midway may have also written her death sentence. The ship that limped into battle carried weaknesses built into her bones during those frantic 72 hours in dry dock. No one wants to say this. The repair effort was heroic. The workers performed beyond what anyone could reasonably ask. The lieutenant commander who said yes to an impossible timeline showed courage and dedication. But heroism does not change physics. Shortcuts have consequences, and the Yorktown paid for them in blood and in steel. She paid for them by spending the last 83 years on the bottom of the Pacific. American carriers were built to survive. Japanese carriers were built to strike. This was not an accident. It was doctrine written into the design philosophy of two nations with opposite understandings of naval warfare. American designers prioritized damage control systems, compartmentalization, firefighting capability, redundant systems. Japanese designers prioritized speed, aircraft capacity, and offensive power. At Midway, the difference proved absolutely decisive. The Akagi, the Kaga, and the Soryu each succumbed to fires that American damage control systems would have contained. Yorktown absorbed hits that would have destroyed any Japanese counterpart. But American design philosophy assumed one critical thing: backup systems would function. The entire doctrine depended on power. Pumps needed electricity. Firefighting systems needed pressure. Counterfeiting required functioning valves and working communications. When the Yorktown lost all power, her design advantages became irrelevant. A commander in Central Station reported it plainly. Without power, nothing could be done to correct the list. The ship was built to survive, but survival required systems that had failed, not from Japanese action, but from short circuits and jury-rigged wiring that the circuit breakers could not contain. Captain Buckmaster faced an impossible choice. The list had reached 26 degrees and was climbing. His engineering officer reported all power lost. His damage control officer confirmed that nothing could stop the flooding. Both men believed capsizing was minutes away. Over 2,000 men stood on decks that were becoming walls. If the ship rolled, if she went over, hundreds would be trapped below. Hundreds more would slide into the water with no hope of rescue. The mathematics of disaster pointed one direction. Buckmaster ordered the ship abandoned, but the Yorktown did not capsize. She floated for 3 more days. The salvage party that reboarded her actually reduced the list. They were making genuine progress. They were actually saving her. Then the Japanese submarine found them and sent 2 more torpedoes. Was Buckmaster's decision to abandon ship premature? Hindsight says yes. The ship proved more resilient than anyone believed possible. With power restored from the Hammond alongside, with trained sailors working the pumps and counter-flooding, the crew was saving her. But Buckmaster did not have hindsight. He had a list of 26 degrees, no electricity, and 2,000 lives in his hands. He made the prudent call, the responsible call, the call that every manual and every piece of training told him to make, The wreck cannot judge him. It can only show what might have been. It can only preserve the evidence of choices made in desperation and the consequences that follow. 3 miles down, nearly 17,000 feet beneath the Pacific, crushing pressure, absolute darkness, cold that never varies from season to season, year to year, decade to decade. This is where the USS Yorktown rests. This is where her crew remains. The exact number of men who went down with her is uncertain. Most accounts say between 81 and 141 died during the battle and sinking. Some were killed by bomb blasts, some were killed by torpedo explosions, some went down with the destroyer Hammond when the Japanese submarine Supido broke her back. Others were lost during the abandonment or in the water afterward. Their bodies were never recovered. The depth made that impossible in 1942. It remains impossible today. The men rest where they fell, where they fought, where they sank. The Navy recognizes what the wreck represents. In 2023, the Naval History and Heritage Command designated the Yorktown a site of extraordinary character. She is a protected, sunken military craft. Salvage is prohibited by federal law. Artifact removal is prohibited. The men who died defending her are afforded in death a protection their ship could not provide in battle. The extreme depth has preserved the Yorktown like nowhere else on Earth. Paint still visible after 83 years. Guns still mounted. A mural still showing its colors. The cold, the pressure, and the darkness have created a time capsule, a moment frozen in time from 1942. But that same depth makes every visit an expedition to the edge of technological capability. The men of the Yorktown are beyond easy reach. They rest in a place few humans will ever see. Every ROV descent is two things simultaneously: investigation and intrusion, discovery and disturbance. The cameras that found the mural also swept through spaces where men died. The lights that illuminated the aircraft also fell upon a tomb. The technology that answers questions also raises questions about whether those questions should be asked. Some believe the wreck should be left alone. The men have rested undisturbed for 83 years. Peace has its own value. The dead cannot benefit from knowing what killed them. Others argue that understanding honors sacrifice. The families deserve answers about what happened to their fathers and grandfathers. Future sailors deserve lessons learned in blood, lessons that might save lives in wars not yet fought. Silence protects no one except those who prefer comfortable myths to difficult truths. The 2023 and 2025 expeditions revealed more than anyone expected, but they also proved how much remains hidden. The complete interior of the ship has never been fully surveyed. Compartments below the hangar deck, engineering spaces where men fought desperately to restore power, machinery rooms where decisions were made and systems failed, the boiler rooms where the superheater units sat, the ones that were never repaired at Pearl Harbor, the ones that limited the Yorktown to 20 knots when she needed 32. What other artifacts are weighted in the darkness? What evidence might finally explain the circuit breaker failures? What stories lie buried in sediment that grows deeper every year? The wreck is changing slowly, imperceptibly, but it is changing. Corrosion works at steel that has resisted for over 8 decades. Marine life colonizes surfaces that once gleamed with navy gray paint. Sediment settles into spaces that were once filled with urgency and fear and the sounds of men fighting to save their ship. Some answers may be lost before technology can find them. The window for discovery is not infinite. Time moves differently 3 miles down, but it still moves. Future expeditions will return. Advanced research institutions are already planning missions, better cameras, more capable machines, longer endurance for the remotely operated vehicles. Each generation of technology reveals what the previous one could not see. What the next mission finds may challenge everything the current evidence suggests. The mystery is not solved. Mysteries never are completely. But the Yorktown is slowly, piece by piece, beginning to tell her story again after 83 years of silence. The men who sailed her did everything right. Damage control parties extinguished fires raging through her compartments in an hour. Flight deck crews patched bomb holes so cleanly and so precisely that returning pilots could not tell where the enemy bombs had hit. Engineers who had trained for years in peacetime now worked under combat conditions they had never imagined, coaxing broken systems back to life with improvised repairs and sheer determination. A captain made the hardest decision a commanding officer can make, the decision that no one wants to make, the decision that keeps captains awake at night for the rest of their lives. He gave the order to abandon his ship, a decision made with imperfect information and terrible pressure and the weight of 2,000 lives depending on whether he was right or wrong. They did everything right, and still the Pacific took her. 3 miles down in permanent darkness, 3 miles down where pressure would crush a human body instantly, 3 miles down where the sun's light has never reached and never will. Yorktown holds her secrets. The cameras have shown us some. The mural, painted by sailors who wanted to be remembered. The aircraft armed and ready for a battle that never came. The car, a mysterious vehicle from the civilian world, intruding into the domain of war. The guns, still pointed at an enemy that stopped coming 83 years ago. But the questions that the cameras raised may matter more than the answers they provided. Questions about the shortcuts made under pressure, questions about systems that failed when failure meant death, questions about what we ask of ships and what we ask of the people who sailed them, questions about whether a captain's decision was right or wrong when all the information available at the time pointed to certain doom. Understanding the Yorktown is not about assigning blame. It is not about saying that particular officers made wrong decisions or that the repair workers at Pearl Harbor did inferior work. Understanding the Yorktown is about understanding what happens when assumptions meet reality, when miracles carry hidden costs, when doing everything right is still not enough to change the outcome, when the best efforts of 1,400 workers and heroic damage control teams cannot overcome the laws of physics and the weight of accumulated damage. It is about understanding that history is not simple, that military decisions made in war are made with incomplete information, that the official story, the comfortable narrative, is sometimes incomplete. The 2023 and 2025 expeditions transformed our understanding of what happened in those final hours. The hangar deck, finally visible after 25 years since Robert Ballard's initial discovery, revealed that the Yorktown was not simply a ship that was overwhelmed and sank. She was a ship where specific systems failed, specific failures in specific areas. The electrical system that had been hastily repaired, the boilers that had never been fixed, the welded patches that may have transmitted shock waves differently than riveted repairs would have, these were not generic failures, these were specific vulnerabilities that had been built into her structure during the compressed timeline at Pearl Harbor. The presence of the aircraft still aboard suggested something that historians had only theorized. The crew had been in the process of recovering aircraft when the second wave of Japanese torpedo bombers struck. They were not idle. They were not sitting in despair. They were actively working to prepare for the next phase of combat. The aircraft with bombs still armed in their release cradles indicated that the battle was ongoing, that American naval aviators were still preparing to fight, that Yorktown was not a ship that had given up. She was a ship that was still in the final moments preparing to strike back. The mysterious Ford station wagon raises perhaps the most intriguing question of all. Not about the battle, not about the sinking, but about the lives of the men aboard. Someone brought a civilian vehicle onto a warship. For what purpose? To use it in port cities? To remind himself of home? To give his crew a momentary connection to the normal world they had left behind, the car's presence suggests that the men aboard the Yorktown, despite being sailors on a warship during wartime, remained connected to civilian life. They remained human beings with possessions and memories and connections to the world beyond the Navy. In the chaos and horror of naval combat, someone thought the car was important enough to preserve, important enough to keep aboard. The car survived the sinking when so many men did not. What this tells us about the crew, about their mindset, about their connection to civilian life and home remains unknown. But the fact that it was there, that it persisted through the decades on the ocean floor, that modern technology finally revealed its existence after 83 years, speaks to something beyond military history. It speaks to the human experience of war. It speaks to the men who fought at Midway. It speaks to their hopes and their connections to a world they had left behind. The comparison between American and Japanese carrier design philosophy offers another layer of understanding. The Yorktown survived her battle damage longer than any Japanese carrier would have survived equivalent damage. The Akagi, the Kaga, and the Tsuyu all went down to fires that American damage control philosophy might have contained. American carriers were designed with the assumption that they might be hit, that they might take damage, that they needed to survive that damage and fight again. Japanese carriers were designed with the assumption that they would attack first so devastatingly that the enemy would have no opportunity to attack back. This fundamental philosophical difference shaped every aspect of their design, every system, every redundancy, every backup. When the Yorktown lost power, her American design advantages became meaningless. All the redundant systems, all the compartmentalization, all the firefighting equipment required electricity to function. When that single critical system failed, the entire structure of American damage control doctrine collapsed. A ship designed to survive became a ship that could not control her own fate. The diesel generator started, power was available. But the circuit breakers failed. Short circuits in hastily repaired wiring rendered the backup power useless. One failure cascading into another, one vulnerability leading to the next. This is what the wreck has finally revealed. Not that the Yorktown was poorly built, but that she was wounded, hastily repaired, pushed beyond her tested capabilities, and then asked to fight the most important naval battle of the Pacific War. The ethical questions surrounding the continued exploration of the wreck have not been resolved, and perhaps they cannot be. The Navy has designated her a war grave, a protected wreck, a sacred site. The men who died aboard her rest there. They have been undisturbed for 83 years. There is value in that undisturbed state. There is respect in leaving the dead to their peace. But there is also value in understanding, in learning, in extracting lessons that might save lives in future conflicts, in honoring the sacrifice not just by preserving the wreck, but by using it to understand what happened. Different people will come to different conclusions about whether the expeditions should continue. Some historians and Navy officials argue that every mission to the wreck is an intrusion, a violation of the resting place of the dead. Others argue that every mission is a responsibility to the men who died there, that understanding their sacrifice requires understanding how they died, that pretending mysteries don't exist honors them less than solving those mysteries, that the families of the men who went down with the Yorktown have earned the right to know what happened, that future naval officers need to understand these lessons written in steel and lives at the bottom of the Pacific. What is certain is this: the Yorktown story has been transformed by the discoveries of 2023 and 2025. The comfortable narrative of a ship overwhelmed by superior forces has been replaced by a more complex understanding. Yes, the Yorktown was hit by bombs and torpedoes and a submarine attack. Yes, the accumulated damage was severe. But the manner of her loss, the specific sequence of failures, the role of the rushed repairs at Pearl Harbor, these have all been illuminated by technology that could finally reach the places where the truth was hidden. The mural that decorated the hangar deck, the one that painted the Yorktown's history on her walls, survived 83 years on the ocean floor. That survival itself is remarkable, that those colors remained vivid enough to be clearly visible through modern cameras, through the darkness, through the sediment and the corrosion and the passage of decades. It suggests something about the environment at 3 miles down. The cold preserves, the pressure preserves, the darkness preserves, time moves differently in that place, the laws of decay that govern the surface world operate more slowly there. A hand-painted mural from 1942 can survive intact while its creators have been gone for more than 3/4 of a century. What that mural meant to the men who painted it cannot be known precisely, but we can infer. They painted their ship's history on the walls of their hangar deck. They wanted others to know where the Yorktown had been, what missions she had accomplished, what oceans she had crossed, what dangers she had faced. In the midst of a naval war, while preparing for combat, while knowing that they might die at any moment, these sailors took the time to paint a map, to commemorate their ship, to ensure that the Yorktown would be remembered. What they could not have known was that 83 years later, their painted mural would be among the first things discovered when advanced technology finally reached their ship. Their desire to be remembered was fulfilled, but not in the way they imagined, not through the official historical record, but through the preservation of their own work, their own art, their own testimony painted on the walls of their ship. The aircraft in the hangar deck tell a similar story of preparation and dedication. Those dauntless dive bombers were not abandoned in disarray. They were positioned carefully. They carried ordnance. They were ready for combat. One plane bore clear markings, Bureau number 4581, identified as coming from the Enterprise's bombing squadron. That aircraft had somehow found its way to the Yorktown's hangar deck during the chaos of battle. Perhaps it had been damaged and diverted to the Yorktown to be recovered. Perhaps it had been captured as part of the organic cooperation between the 3 American carriers at Midway. Whatever the cause, the plane survived the sinking and remained in its position for 83 years, a testimony to the last moments of the battle. The bomb still attached to one aircraft's release cradle, still armed after more than 8 decades, raises questions about the exact moment when the Japanese torpedo struck. If the bomb was armed and still secure, then the crew had been in the process of preparing another strike. Yorktown had launched her morning airstrike. She had received returning aircraft from the Enterprise, and then, in the preparation for another coordinated attack with her sister carriers, the Japanese had struck. The torpedo bombers had found her. The brief window of preparation had closed. The crew had been caught in the act of preparing for war when war came back to them with sudden and overwhelming violence. The armed bomb, frozen in time, preserved by the cold and pressure and darkness, is the artifact that best captures that moment, the moment when preparation ended and survival began. The Pacific Ocean is vast. It covers nearly half the Earth's surface. It contains millions of cubic miles of water, countless underwater mountains, trenches that plunge to depths that human beings can barely comprehend. Somewhere in that vast expanse, 3 miles down, beyond the reach of normal diving, accessible only to advanced, remotely operated vehicles piloted by skilled operators, the USS Yorktown rests. She is one ship among countless millions of tons of steel and wood and human remains that lie beneath the waves. But she is not just any ship. She was a symbol of American engineering. She was a platform that launched the aircraft that helped turn the Pacific War. She was a ship sailed by men who did everything right and still faced loss. She was a ship that carried not just military equipment and weapons, but also the personal effects of sailors, a mural, a car, the dreams and memories and connections to home of nearly 3,000 men. What the Yorktown teaches us, what the discoveries of the recent expeditions have illuminated, is that history is more complex than official narratives suggest. That military decisions made in wartime are made with incomplete information and terrible pressure. That heroism and tragedy are often intertwined. That the shortcuts made to get a wounded carrier back to sea in 3 days, the shortcuts that seemed like triumph at the time, carried consequences that only became apparent 83 years later, visible only through advanced technology that could finally peer into the darkness where she rested. The Yorktown story is not a simple story of victory or defeat. It is a story of sacrifice and determination and the weight of human decisions made under impossible circumstances. And so the story of the USS Yorktown continues, not with the sinking in 1942, not with the discovery in 1998, but with every new expedition, every new camera descending into the darkness, every new artifact revealed by advanced technology that our ancestors could never have imagined. The Pacific keeps her now, but sometimes when the technology is ready and the will exists to look, when skilled researchers dedicate themselves to understanding the past, the Yorktown gives up fragments of truth. The men of the Yorktown earned that much. They earned the effort. They earned the exploration. They earned the commitment to understanding what happened to them, how they died, what they were trying to do in those final moments before power failed, and the list grew too steep. We owe them that effort. We owe them the pursuit of truth over comfortable myths. We owe them the investigation and the discovery and the willingness to ask hard questions about what happened at Midway and why. Because in understanding the Yorktown, we understand not just military history, but the human condition itself, the determination to survive, the will to preserve, the desire to be remembered. These are the lessons that echo from the deep, broadcast through the darkness by the artifacts of men who lived and fought and died nearly 9 decades ago, waiting for technology to finally catch up so their story could be fully told.